how's it going? Once again, I'm back in time, trekking through the 8 to 16-bit era of graphical displays, shifting through various older projects in my own way and in their own measures, pushing the ever-evolving wave of hardware tech, pushing through the rising industry that would become what it is today. AAA continues being new for better or worse, whereas the indie scene does one of two things: creating new experiences because of the relatively low risk factor, and making old things new once again. You have brand new titles made by smaller studios and developers, and the long history behind the ROM hacking and homebrewing scene going around. I bring up the indie scene a lot, and for good reason. And the subject for this video will also, in its own way, demonstrate why I'll continue to bring up the indie word until the end of time. Here is a title called Slaughter. It is a creative and unholy abomination written in the language of C, made by a developer who had an intense and hellish desire to push the NES platform to its limits, while still taking into account the limitations behind the hardware itself. As I explained before in my last video, homebrewed games differ from other retro-inspired indie games because of the fact that homebrewers utilize development kits for the old consoles, and are also in the same file format as other games for the platform. So when you download this game, you'll also see that it is in the NES file format, so you'll then have to run it on an NES emulator or find what I presume would work on homebrew hardware such as the EverDrive N8. The developer Mindbleach has in the past created games that approach the idea of working on hardware from the past, looking at every corner and surface of its architecture and design and turning what-ifs into reality. That's the beauty of homebrew development, of how the modern applications of programming and knowledge developed over the decades has led to retro resurrection. A lot of the retro games from the 80s and the 90s haven't aged well in terms of their controls, let alone the graphics, at least from the perspective of modernized controls and graphical fidelity. But there is a sea of developers that want to make old things new again, even if it means using severe limitations in order to conjure new ideas onward. Slaughter for the NES is an attempt to try and make a first-person shooter for the console itself. While there were light gun-based games or rail shooters available for it, as well as first-person games released on other platforms during those years, there really wasn't anything like Wolfenstein 3D or Doom released for the NES console, or at least I haven't found anything like those two for it. This game is a technical achievement, a nightmare, and a unique exploration of how a first-person shooter is illustrated. While the NES could display polygons, even if it was in a pseudo 3D capacity, it was incredibly limited, and 2D development was, in contrast, a lot cheaper and preferable due to being able to render more colors and pixels on screen. The way Slaughter shows its display is very jarring. It almost appears as if you're looking through a 2D image, but the pixels shift with every rotation and movement that you make. A lot of FPS games have clearer visuals because of the objects in the environments having their own assigned textures or sprites. But Slaughter has what looks to me anyways, an assembly of tiles forming basic shapes separated by color and that shift with every rotation and movement. So when you play through the level, you'll have to discern what is what in terms of the walls, the floors and the stairways, as well as the enemy sprites themselves. When you move your character, take notice of the individual sprites that move and shift. It took me some time to get used to the tiles moving as I explored the level and shot at the noticeable sprites that would appear and emit an 8-bit sound, making you aware of their pixelated presence. Believe it or not, there is actually elevation in this game too, which is genuinely impressive since first-person games or titles like Wolfenstein 3D back then were generally horizontal by their map design, condemning you to a flat floor. But because of the unique functions that each sprite represents on the screen, you can make leaps with the sprint mechanic, even if it makes you look far from a distance since falling down is at a snail's pace. So you can actually leap from one place to another if you're quick enough. The objective in this game is to find the exit while killing the monsters that come across your path. Eventually you will find an exit, indicated by this particular sprite, that functions as a portal. You get some vague text and then you're at a very similar level but with more enemies to kill. You have a shotgun, a machine gun of sorts, and a bomb that you can use to take out multiple enemies at once if aimed correctly. Each enemy sprite has projectiles that they fire at you as well, but dodging said projectiles is a bit confusing at times because there were moments where I would move to the left or the right, only to still get hit, as long as it was on the screen. Personally, I didn't get very far into this game because I honestly wasn't enjoying it that much, and the visual fuckery, while technically impressive for the platform that it's based on, is not really something that I would be fiending for anytime soon. Projects like this, for me at least, are more for the technical exploration and appreciation of a piece of hardware, how a platform can be pushed to its absolute limits, rather than being something to enjoy and play. It was like that time when I had a go at an FPS that had a resolution of 8x8. It was an absolute nightmare to navigate through, but it was really interesting to see how an FPS could be made with so many limitations on top of it. It's also similar to the ideas behind the low-res jam on itch.io, where a community of developers get together and create games with very low resolutions, going down to 64x64 or even 32x32 in some cases. I've talked about how limitations can bring out the best in creativity, and I still believe that, but it doesn't always mean that I'll like or enjoy the game, and as someone who has explored and still continues to explore game development, I found Slaughter to be more interesting on the dev side of things, rather than just being a fun game to play, which for me it wasn't. However, that's not to say that someone else wouldn't enjoy this, it's just that the game is cluttered to death with tiles for me, and while some of the sprite work is pretty decent, especially for the weapons, it just ended up being too much for me to play for long periods of time, which is why I eventually just said I'm out at a later point. Checking the developer's library, there are other projects that follow the same mandate, and one of them is also hellish to look at. At Hell's Gate is another FPS, inspired by Doom, but made with the mind of 256 IBM AT computers that were released in the 80s. To run it, you'll need to download DOSBox for it. Just drag the exe file directly into the DOSBox shortcut and you're good to go. And here is another visual nightmare to look at. Awesome. You have weapons, pickups, and enemies to shoot at as you explore and try to differentiate the objects in the environments, figuring out where to move and go exactly. I will admit though, it was a bit easier to navigate through this game than say in Slaughter. However, I didn't play this one for very long either, for the same reason I played the Slaughter NES game for a short amount of time. I don't know a lot about NES development yet, let alone on something like this. But even though I didn't enjoy these two projects very much, they did at the very least give me a new perspective on how an FPS can also be displayed. What if a Doom-like shooter was possible in '86? If the idea was realized back then, could it have actually been done with the available hardware? Questions like this are frequently explored and executed within the homebrewing community, squeezing as much juice as possible out of the retro hardware. Homebrewing is one of the most fascinating dimensions within the indie scene, because it goes beyond the aesthetics that indie devs more than often use for their games. And while there's no right or wrong in terms of how you make your game, whether it's through writing it entirely through language or with a game engine, it's the work that you put in that matters. And Slaughter, despite my torturous playthrough of it, is a prime example of the NES's untapped potential. Give the Slaughter NES game a try. You may like it or you may really hate it, but I hope you can at least appreciate what it does try to do, since I haven't really seen anything else like it on the NES. Thanks for watching.